In today's episode, I'll talk about two interesting stories. In the first story of the day, I'll talk about how batteries are now becoming the backbone of clean energy revolution and why India cannot really afford to be left behind in this. And in the second story of the day, I'll talk about how a tiny new RBI rule could very quietly transform financial regulation in India in a very big way. Welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerotha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest news and stories in the financial markets in a way that is easy for all of us to understand, yet one level deeper as compared to your traditional news channels. I'm your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Monday, the 19th of May. Over the last few years, batteries have very quietly gone from being in the background of technology to now in the center of our energy future. Earlier, whenever we thought about batteries, we probably imagined those little AA or AAA cells inside our TV remotes or the ones inside our phones or laptops. But today they are playing a much bigger and a more powerful role, and there has been a surge in attention around them for a very good reason. And at the very center of this entire interest is green energy transition. See, as the world tries to move away from fossil fuels like coal and petroleum, we need better ways to power things, especially things like cars and electricity grids. And that is where batteries are stepping in now. They're no longer just accessories, they are now very key players in this transition. In fact, without batteries, a clean energy future may not even be possible on Earth. There are two big reasons why battery demand is booming today. First is electric vehicles, because EVs, as they are known, are becoming more and more common. And the most important part of an EV, as you might have realized by now, is the battery. It's not just a power source for the EV, it is also the most expensive part in a car. At one point, a battery would make up to 30 to 50% of the cost of the entire vehicle. And that, of course, is huge. But thankfully, now with better battery technology and the larger scale at which things are happening, the cost of making these batteries is slowly coming down. In fact, the average battery prices for electric vehicles recently dipped below $1,000 per kilowatt hour, which is a huge milestone. But that said, even with falling prices, batteries still heavily influence the cost of an electric vehicle. And since EV sales are growing very rapidly across the world, battery demand is growing just as fast, if not more. The second reason, like I mentioned, is renewable energy storage. You can think about solar panels as a great example of this. They only generate electricity when the sun is shining. And very similarly, wind turbines only work when the wind blows. But that said, electricity demand does not really follow the sun or wind, right? We need power even when it is dark or the wind is not blowing. So the question is, how do we store the energy when it is available and then be able to use it when it is not available? That is where large-scale batteries come into the picture. Now, these are called battery energy storage systems, or BESS for short. They basically absorb the extra power when there is too much supply, and they release it slowly when the supply starts to drop. They also help stabilize the electricity grid if there are sudden changes in demand or supply. So as the share of wind and solar energy increases in the world, having such good backup systems becomes even more important for all of us. One energy researcher summarized it very well. He said that batteries are the single biggest missing piece in a renewable energy powered world. Now the thing is, it's not that batteries are new to us. We have used them for multiple decades now, right from car batteries to inverter backups at home. But the real shift is in scale right now. See, until very recently, there was smaller and slower growing usage of batteries. EVs and renewable energy storage are a completely different league though. They are growing very fast and also at a scale that we have never ever seen before. So that said, while none of us in the team are energy experts as such, there is one thing that is very clear, that without batteries, the clean energy transition simply cannot happen in the world. And that also has some bigger consequences. If we do not make this transition, we are staring at rising carbon emissions, worsening climate change, heat waves, glacier meltings, and everything else that comes along with it. So therefore, we decided to read up, not with the aim of being experts, but just to understand the basics. Things like what kinds of battery are used, what is the supply chain behind them, who makes them, and where does India even stand in this entire story. So let me explain the most basic question here, which is, what exactly is a battery? See, a battery is simply a device that stores energy and releases it when it is required. But not all batteries are the same. Over time, different kinds of battery chemistries have been developed for different use cases. The oldest and the most basic ones are lead-acid batteries. Now, these are cheap and reliable, which is why they have been widely used in car engines and in UPS backup systems. But the problem is that they are bulky and heavy, and they do not store a lot of energy. So they are not suited for modern uses like EVs or grid storage. Then came nickel-based batteries, which were quite common in electronics and early hybrid cars like the Toyota Prius. They could basically store more energy than lead-acid batteries, but even they have mostly been replaced by a newer and more advanced type of battery, which is the lithium-ion battery. Now, lithium-ion batteries, or Li-ion for short, are now the gold standard for batteries. They are lighter, they store more energy, and they are used in everything right from smartphones to electric cars. Commercial production of these batteries began in the 1990s, and since then they have improved quite a bit. But that said, even with lithium-ion batteries, there are multiple subtypes. Two of the most common ones here are the NMC and the LFP. NMC stands for nickel, manganese, cobalt. These batteries store a lot of energy in a small space, which basically makes them very ideal for light electric vehicles and also mobile phones. But that said, cobalt is expensive, not easily available, and usually mined under poor working conditions, especially in places like Democratic Republic of Congo. Also, NMC batteries can overheat or even catch fire if they are not handled properly. On the other hand, LFP batteries use lithium iron phosphate, which means they do not need cobalt or nickel. Therefore, they are cheaper and safer, and they do not overheat easily. But the downside is that they store lesser energy than NMC batteries, so they are heavier. But recent innovations have improved LFP performance quite a bit, and today almost half of the new EVs sold globally use LFP batteries itself. They are now about 30% cheaper per kilowatt hour as compared to the NMCs. Now, there is also a new type of battery that is being worked on in the world right now. These are solid state batteries, and they are one of the most talked about batteries in the world. They promise to be safer and to also store more energy, but they are still in the early stages of development and are not really used commercially yet. Sodium ion batteries are one more alternative here. Sodium is cheaper and a lot more abundant than lithium, but again, the current energy density is much lower. So these are still being tested again. So basically, with all of this GAN that I'm giving you, the key point that I'm trying to make is that no battery type is absolutely perfect. There is always a trade-off. Some are more powerful and some are cheaper. Some last longer and others are a little bit more safe. So depending on the use case, which could be a car, a phone, a grid, etc., manufacturers choose what makes the most amount of sense. Anyway, let's now move on and look at the bigger picture, which is what does it take to make a battery and who does what over here. See, there's a long value chain behind every single battery. It starts with mining minerals like lithium, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and graphite. Now, these are not spread equally across the world either. For example, Australia produces over half of the world's lithium. South America also has large reserves, and India recently found a promising deposit in Jammu and Kashmir, but it is still too early to say how viable that is. Cobalt mostly comes from one place, which is the Democratic Republic of Congo. Around 70% of the world's cobalt is mined right there. But there is also a dark side to it, which is much of that comes from unregulated and unsafe conditions like I mentioned. Anyway, moving on, nickel is mined in several places, but for the kind that is needed in batteries, Indonesia is the leader over there. Other sources include Russia, Canada, Australia, and the Philippines. Graphite, meanwhile, is dominated by China, both in natural reserves and in synthetic production. So basically, once all of these materials are mined, they then need to be refined to battery-grade chemicals like lithium carbonate or nickel sulfate. Now, this step is energy intensive and is highly specialized, and it is almost entirely controlled by one country, which is China. About 80% of the world's lithium refining happens right in China, and the story is very similar for other minerals as well. Anyway, the next step is to turn all of these refined materials into battery parts like cathodes, anodes, and electrolytes. Once again, most of this happens in China and other East Asian countries. Then the next step is cell manufacturing, and this is where all the components are assembled into battery cells. Now, these require highly sophisticated factories, which are often called gigafactories, and China once again dominates this stage as well. It makes over 75% of the world's battery cells. Two Chinese companies, which is CATL and BYD, are among the world's largest battery makers globally. South Korean firms like LG and Samsung, and even Japan's Panasonic, are also major players here. Anyway, finally, battery cells are then packed together into modules and packs, especially for things like electric cars, and this step often happens closer to where the final product is being assembled because batteries are heavy and also expensive to ship. Also, the pack needs to be customized in order to fit the product that it is going to. So basically, you might have noticed that China's name comes up again and again across the battery supply chain, right from mining and refining to even cell production and the components. And that, mind you, is a massive strategic advantage. But for the other countries, including India, this poses a big risk. The thing is, if you depend too much on one country for critical components, you become vulnerable, both economically and politically. So the question then is, where does India stand in all of this? See, traditionally, India's battery industry has always focused on lead-acid batteries, which is used for regular cars, inverters, and telecom towers. Companies like Exide, Amar Raja Battery have been around for multiple decades now. But lead-acid batteries, like I said, are not suitable suitable for EVs or large renewable projects. When the world shifted to lithium-ion batteries, India was sort of caught behind. And today, we don't yet make lithium-ion battery cells at scale. Almost all of the battery cells that are used in Indian electric vehicles or storage projects are actually imported, and around 75% of those come from one country, which is China. What we do in India, though, is assemble these imported cells into battery packs. But like I told you, that is only the final step. The earlier and the more valuable sort of steps all happen abroad. And this makes India's clean energy push a lot more expensive and also, more importantly, very fragile. Basically, if anything disrupts the supply or if prices starts to rise, we do not have much control over anything. The Indian government, of course, knows this problem. So in 2021, they launched a scheme called the Production Linked Incentive Scheme for Advanced Battery Manufacturing. The idea here was to encourage Indian companies to build gigafactories and start making lithium-ion cells locally in our country. The government offered 18,100 crore rupees in incentive, and after a bidding process, 4 winners were chosen: Ola Electric, Hyundai Global Motors, Reliance New Energy, and Rajesh Exports. Now, these companies promised to set up large cell factories in India. The plan was that by now they would be making Indian-made cells. But the problem is that it has not gone according to plan as such. At the end of 2024, none of these factories had started production also. Many missed their deadlines and requested extensions as well. It turns out setting up a gigafactory is not at all easy. The technology, machinery, and the expertise are all very complex, and we still rely very heavily on foreign players for all of it. And that makes India's battery journey a very difficult task. But of course, the need is very urgent, and India is already the world's fourth largest automobile market. We want 30% of all the new car sales to be electric by 2030, and that makes India's battery journey a very difficult one. On that note, let's move on and talk about the second story. See, there is a new RBI regulation that has recently come into effect. It is only 3 pages long, but its impact could be absolutely massive. And at first look, this might not look like a big deal at all because it does not change interest rates, it does not introduce any new compliance rules, and it does not even touch our money directly. But in many ways, this very tiny document could end up transforming the way India's financial sector works very quietly but also very fundamentally. Let me start from the very beginning. Basically, for the first time ever, the RBI has laid out a clear written process it must follow before bringing in new regulations or changing existing regulations, and that is absolutely massive. And the reason why I say this is massive is because financial regulation in India has for a very long time had a major flaw. Regulators like the RBI are supposed to ensure stability, and that means they often have to act quickly, decisively, and sometimes unilaterally. But the problem is that in doing so, the RBI has often operated in a way that feels opaque and at times even arbitrary. For businesses and investors, that's of course a real problem because when you do not know what might come next, you are always getting ready for a surprise. And in finance, a surprise regulation can sort of destroy entire business models overnight. Now, this is not an exaggeration, mind you. Just look at what happened to Slice, which is a fintech company. See, for a while, it was one of the hottest startups in India and was aiming to disrupt the credit card business. It also partnered with NBFCs to offer credit through prepaid cards and was issuing lakhs of them every single month, more than any other established banks as well. But the problem was that in 2022, the RBI suddenly decided that NBFCs could no longer offer credit via prepaid instruments. Now, this move was meant to reduce the risk in the system, but the problem was that it was not discussed and it gave companies like Slice no time to prepare whatsoever. And the result was that Slice's entire business model was suddenly derailed. Or you can even take the infamous circular that RBI put out in 2018 as another example. They ordered banks to start insolvency proceedings against defaulters the moment they missed even a single repayment. No delays, no excuses. Now, banks were thrown into chaos while trying to implement this until the Supreme Court stepped in and struck the circular down, calling it outside RBI's legal powers. Now, these examples highlight a very deep issue, which is that the way the RBI has gone about making regulations has usually lacked transparency and also consultation in many ways. One study in 2019 put numbers to this as well. It found out that out of over 1,000 regulations that the RBI issued, it sought public comments on just 14 of them. That is just about 1.4%. And mind you, only 2% of these regulations came with any kind of explanation about what the regulation was trying to achieve. And this is what economists call a regulatory risk. Basically, when companies do not know how or why rules are made, they live in constant uncertainty. And that very uncertainty makes it very hard for them to plan, invest, or even grow their business. Now, honestly, to be fair, this is not just about the RBI. Financial regulations across the world face a very tough balancing act. On one hand, they need to be independent and fast-moving because they are dealing with very high-stakes systems where delays could trigger a big crisis. But on the other hand, in a democracy, you ideally want new laws and regulations to go through a a process of consultation, of debate, and also public reasoning. Now, in most sectors, that is handled by the parliament, but financial regulations usually bypasses that because it is too technical or too urgent, or maybe both in some senses. And that is exactly where problems begin to come. The tension, which is between fast regulations and democratic accountability, has been discussed in India for over a decade now. In fact, in 2013, the government set up something called the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, or the FSLRC, in order to fix this exact problem. The commission argued that regulators like the RBI were essentially mini governments wherein they made rules, enforced them, and also judged disputes. And this was the kind of power that needed proper checks and balances as well. So therefore, the FSLRC proposed a 7-step process for making regulations. Before drafting a rule, regulators had to spell out the problem that they were solving. They had to publish a draft along with a cost-benefit analysis, then invite public comments for 30 days, then respond to those public comments, and also revisit each regulations every 5 years. Now, there would even be a dedicated tribunal where companies could challenge regulatory decisions. Now, this was of course a bold idea because it was a full blueprint of how to make a regulation more transparent and predictable. Unfortunately though, it was never fully adopted. But that said, the ideas behind it never really died either. Over time, different regulators started quietly borrowing from the FSLRC playbook, and now the RBI has done the exact same, only a little more formally. The turning point came in 2022 when the RBI launched something called the Regulations Review Authority, or the RRA. The initial goal was fairly modest, which was just to clean up old rules and to reduce paperwork. But once it got going, it uncovered a much deeper mess. The RBI rulebook was bloated, confusing, and often even inconsistent. It had hundreds of overlapping circulars, mountains of forms, which some, by the way, even required physical filling, and a website that was impossible for normal human beings to navigate. The RRI then set out to fix this. They proposed scrapping out over 700 old circulars, combining and digitizing returns, and creating a single online dashboard for regulatory filings. But more importantly, they did not even stop there. They recommended something more fundamental, that the RBI adopted a disciplined, structured way of writing and publishing regulations. And that basically meant standardized templates, clear objectives, repeal clauses for old rules, and most critically, public consultation. And now, with this new framework for formulating regulations, that process is finally being formalized. And from now on, any important regulations that the RBI wants to introduce will first go up as a draft on its website. Now, that draft will include a short note explaining why the RBI is making the rule, what power it is using, and what the rule is supposed to do, and also what kind of impact it is expecting. That draft will remain open for comments for at least 21 days. And once that is done, the RBI will publish a summary of all the comments that it has received and explain whether or not it made changes based on them. If it makes any big changes, it will have to run the consultation once again. Now, that said, there are exceptions, of course. If the RBI needs to act fast, say during a financial crisis or something on those lines, it can skip this process. But even then, they will have to explain why they skip this entire process. Now, I know all of this might sound a little bit basic and maybe even irrelevant to some of us personally, but the thing is that it marks a massive cultural shift in how financial regulation works in our country. Investors and businesses will no longer wake up to random circulars that sort of shake up the system overnight. They will have time to prepare and maybe even influence the direction the RBI takes. And over time, this will hopefully reduce the regulatory risk that has long haunted the financial sector of India. A veteran investor, Mark Mobius, recently said that India is his top destination to invest in, but our country's heavy compliance burden makes it very difficult for him. So basically, if this new process delivers on what it promises, that very burden could start to ease little by little. That brings me to the end of the two stories of the day. With that, let's move on to the final section and talk about the quick news headlines. First, Reliance Industries Limited has raised $2.9 billion through a dual currency offshore syndicated loan, marking the largest such deal by an Indian company in more than a year. The loan includes $2.4 billion in US dollars and $67.7 billion, which is approximately $462 million in Japanese yen. This is backed by 55 participating banks, and this transaction also represents the largest lender group for any Asian syndicated loan in 2025. Second, Singapore Telecommunications, or Singtel, has sold 71 million shares of Bharti Airtel through its unit Pastel Limited, fetching Singapore dollars 2 billion, which is around 1.54 billion US dollars, at a price of 1814 rupees per share, which represents a 2.85% discount to Airtel's previous closing price. Third and the final one for the day, ITC Hotels reported a 43.77% year-on-year jump in standalone net profit to 264.05 crore rupees in quarter 4 of FY 2025. This is compared to 183.66 crore rupees in the same period last year. Revenue from operations rose 13% to 981.49 crore rupees, and on a consolidated basis, net profit stood at 257.85 crore rupees, which is up 40.36% year over year, while revenue climbed 16.89% to 1060.62 crore rupees. That's all the news and stories I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this show. This is your host Anurag Bansal signing off. Take care and goodbye. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.